Welcome to Innovations in Psychedelic Funding. I am Julie Holland. I am the moderator. I am a psychiatrist, particularly interested in psychedelic issues. I've got 5 books out, the most recent of which is called Good Chemistry, The Science of Connection. I am particularly interested in the issue of death and dying. I feel like the field of medicine has a real blind spot when it comes to this. And we are very good at ushering in beings, and we've got neonatal intensive care units, and we've got midwives and doulas, but what we don't really have are ways to sort of gracefully usher people out. And I'm really excited that NWELL is covering psychedelics on this conference because it's another way of thinking about things and doing things. We've got a great panel today. I want to give them a chance to introduce themselves and explain a little bit about why they're interested in psychedelics or why they're equipped to talk about psychedelics for this conference. And then I also was wondering if anybody would want to just say anything about the issues of death and dying, or why they feel, why they felt called to speak on this particular panel. Can we start with Dr. Jerrold Rosenbaum, please?
Thank you, Julie. It's really great to be here and with my colleagues and Julie, Shelby, Daniel, and particularly grateful to Daniel and Palo Santo for supporting this conference. So I'm a psychiatrist. I've been a psychiatrist for a long time, about 50 years, and have spent a lot of my career developing programs in psychopharmacology focused on treatment-resistant depression and anxiety disorders at Mass General Hospital and Harvard Medical School, where I'm a professor of psychiatry. I got interested in this area because my experience over the years is that however creative, innovative, and hardworking I and my colleagues were, there were always people who suffered and continue to suffer despite our best efforts. And then we needed to do better. And I see a lot of promise in these new agents. And in my conversion experience to being positive about these, one of the most impressive pieces of data were the changes in how people felt existentially, who were facing either catastrophic or terminal diagnoses, and how that changed their world for them. So that was very inspiring. Thank you.
Next, we have Shelby Hartman from DoubleBlind magazine and other ventures. Shelby, please introduce yourself.
Well, you already said it. I'm from DoubleBlind magazine. It's a media company that covers all things pertaining to the psychedelic movement. And I've also been writing and reporting on psychedelics for Rolling Stone, Vice, and a number of other media outlets for a while now. For me, of course, I'm passionate about psychedelics because of their potential to disrupt our current mental health epidemic. But to me, I'm especially interested in sort of end-of-life care in the context of psychedelics, because one of the things that has always really struck me in my reporting is the FDA approval process. And we'll get to talking a little bit more about that. But essentially, of course, it's important for proving the safety and efficacy of drugs, but also there are limitations. And one of them being that, at least at this point, if a drug is being studied, it needs to be attached to a particular indication. And that doesn't always include everybody who is at the end of their life. So I think that this is a really important and relevant way to have broader conversations about, who might be left behind, or how we can create a medical system that includes everybody who needs help.
Thank you very much, Shelby. Yeah, I hope we will continue to talk about inclusion throughout this panel. And Daniel Goldberg, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Daniel Goldberg, co-founder of the Palo Santo Fund. Our mission is to really help increase the supply of accessible mental health and addiction treatment solutions. We're a VC fund completely focused on the psychedelic space, and I've been in this for about in the psychedelic space personally for about 4 years and professionally for a couple of years, and that is considered to be, I guess, I'm considered to be a veteran in some circles, but which is fascinating in psychedelics. But we certainly stand on the shoulders of all of the people like you, Julie, and Shelby, and even you, Jerry. Even though I know you're new to psychedelics, the work you've been doing has been supportive in other ways for many years. So yeah, really happy to be here.
So one of the things we are supposed to be talking about, but I may want to dispatch it fairly quickly because I think there are other interesting topics, is this idea of fundraising. So I think we'll stick with you, Daniel, for the first question, which is just sort of, what has it been like to raise capital the last couple of years in this field?
Yeah, it's I hate to say it's been a trip. It feels trite, but it has been a trip. Look, raising capital is an incredibly important part of my work, but it really is the least favorite part of my job. I think you have to be a bit of a sociopath if you really enjoy raising capital. There are those out there. I actually hate it. That being said, psychedelics is a really, really unique field to be in right now for a lot of reasons. And one aspect that really took me by surprise is it's an incredible magnet right now for talent in a lot of ways. The field is attracting top scientists and researchers from outside the field who weren't previously interested in psychedelics, from neuroscience, medicinal chemistry, of course, psychiatry, pharmacology, and that does extend to our investor base. We have a really incredible group of investors with Palo Santo now that are all passionate about this field, but for very different reasons. Some have personal stories of healing. They're connected to the medicine through themselves or loved ones. Some are really deep into the science. We have biotech executives, mental health professionals. We have hedge fund managers who are just really interested in the outsized returns, but then get very interested in the medicine and what's going on. So it is a very sophisticated and eclectic group right now, and their backgrounds are adding a lot of value to our portfolio. So it's been a lot of fun. There's just a lot of great people that want to be a part of this movement, and I think we feel fortunate to get to know them better through the process of fundraising. So it's made it fun to raise money again. Put it that way.
I appreciate I'm glad you're having fun, Daniel. It's important. And you're doing a great job. So in case you need a pat on the back. Jerry, I was wondering if you would be comfortable talking about the challenge of developing new therapeutics.
Yeah. So
and what that's been like.
Yeah.
I know it's a very broad question.
It's broad, and there are different levels of it. So first, I have to say, from my perspective, it's absolutely bewildering to see the number of companies and the emergence of tremendous valuation in this area so quickly. And I've felt and said that I thought there was a gap in our deep understanding of what's happening in the brain, and that we needed to see more funding of science to go with the promise, enthusiasm, and commercialization of psychedelics. It's looking a little better. Some of the leading companies are starting to sponsor some research at academic centers. The NIH is starting to be more interested in granting research in this area. And there's still hope in philanthropy, but I still think there's a gap there in deep understanding of science, which can only help the acceptance of these potential therapeutics by government agencies that will approve them, and by the population. But to the point about developing new drugs, it's a fraught pathway. It's very challenging. Even when over the years when I've been convinced of the efficacy of novel therapeutics, the problem is with our categories, as Shelby alluded to earlier, is that they're a little artificial. And when you start to study populations, they're heterogeneous, and they create a lot of noise in trying to come up with valid indications of efficacy. You may just have the wrong sample or the wrong design, or there's corruption's too strong a word, but inefficiencies in clinical trials. And so we have to be vigilant, knowing that clinical trials sometimes yield unexpected results. And then once you have the results, even though you feel you have approvable data, there are, as we've seen recently, there are political or bias that can get introduced at the level of advisory committees and approvals. And I think we have to be aware that those who are, I think, most informed about these agents are very interested in what they will bring to patients who suffer. But there's still a lot of people who are unaware and a lot of people who are skeptical. And we're going to have to be sure that we have conversations with them and not just among ourselves.
I'm going to want to follow up on that a little bit later, Jerry, this idea of sort of like the barriers outside the bubble. But I want to turn to Shelby for a minute and just, this may be kind of a tricky question, but I think one of the things that's important for us to talk about is how the funding and the drug development end up affecting public perception of the psychedelic marketplace or of psychedelics, or like what the promise of psychedelics is. I'm just wondering, Shelby, can you talk a little bit about how public perception has shifted over the last, I don't know, 5 or 10 years? I mean, I don't know when you can sort of, pinpoint that things kind of went into overdrive, but I'm wondering if you're comfortable talking about how public perception has shifted.
Yeah, of course. I mean, dramatically. I think that, there's been a lot of theorizing in the world of media as to whether media affects public perception or public perception affects media, or they both kind of shift alongside one another. But we can understand how the public perception of psychedelics has shifted by looking at the history of how the media has covered psychedelics. And so I won't go into it in too much depth, but the first article that really covered the psychedelic movement was in 1957, and it was written by R. Gordon Wasson, and it was on the cover of Life magazine. And it really regarded psychedelics as sort of this curiosity or this wonder, right? That he had gone down to Huatla de Jimenez, he had done psilocybin-containing mushrooms, he wrote about it, nobody had heard of psychedelics. And then we saw a shift in, mainstream media, the way the mainstream media was covering it as the scandal emerged around Timothy Leary and Ram Dass. And it really wasn't until, sort of the mid 2000s when Michael Pollan came out with a piece in the New Yorker called The Trip Treatment, which was talking about all the research investigating psychedelics at Johns Hopkins University. One of those studies was an important study that Jerry referenced, which was looking at the promise of psilocybin for end-of-life distress, that people really started to talk about psychedelics as a therapeutic treatment again. And since then, of course, there's been, all the mainstream outlets, The Atlantic and The Guardian has done tons of great coverage and have covered the therapeutic potential of psychedelics. There's been dozens and dozens of articles. And I think alongside that, we've seen a shift in the public perception as well. Pop culture plays a huge role in this. Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, played a huge role. Even the documentary that came out recently on Netflix, Have a Good Trip, plays a big role. It's easy to forget, when we're in the psychedelic movement and everyone we know is working in the psychedelic movement, that there are swaths and swaths of Americans who actually have no idea what's happening in the realm of psychedelics right now. So even just having, books that are bestsellers and movies on Netflix that are talking about what's happening in the realm of psychedelics and couching these things as potential therapeutics is massive.
I'm thinking about 9 Perfect Strangers and how everybody's talking about this Netflix scripted series about a retreat where people are given medicines without knowing it and also with knowing it. And obviously 9 Perfect Strangers is problematic in many ways, especially around consent. And we could spend all the panel talking about it, but it sort of speaks to what you're saying, Shelby, about that there are people who haven't been educated, need to be educated. I obviously, and maybe not obvious, I really respect DoubleBlind and what you're doing. And I respect anybody who is trying to sort of educate and show both sides of the story. I think sometimes what happens, of course, whether it's a documentary or a scripted series, is that you don't get all the nuance, you get a lot of the promise and, not what to do if it doesn't work. And I just want to make a quick note that there are a lot of people who maybe aren't having a really good experience or had very high expectations about what psychedelic assisted therapy would do for them. And then it didn't happen, for all kinds of reasons, or it went badly. And we need to make sure that there's a lot of sort of infrastructure in place for helping people when it doesn't go well, or preventing any kind of bad outcome. And that really just comes back to education and a lot of preparation, which is really where DoubleBlind comes in, among other places to get information. I am wondering if we can switch gears a little bit. First of all, Jerry, I want you to sort of get back to what we were talking about in terms of barriers outside the bubble. The people who aren't, when you're not preaching to the choir and you're trying to talk to somebody who hasn't sort of drunk the Kool-Aid, what sort of things are coming up in sort of resistance to moving things forward?
So, I mean, there's passive resistance and some active resistance. Passive resistance is not really resistance. It's just that the vast swath of the medical community just has no idea, despite all that's happening in the commercial markets and in the media. But an example is when we formed our center, and I just went to discuss it with the hospital leadership, and they just had no idea. I mean, that this was a thing that would be relevant to patients. This is a leading institution, cares about patient well-being. The other experience I started having is when I was appearing on panels, maybe I would find there were colleagues who were well-informed, but didn't share the enthusiasm. So one case, I was on a panel with a neuroscientist who had done research in this area in the 60s and had a lot of policy and government as well as science experience, and she wasn't negative. She was all for the science part of it, the research, the neuroscience, but kept talking about unintended consequences if we failed to see that medicalization was a way in that could then lead to relatively unrestrained access among people who are not well prepared to have a positive experience, let's say. So there's that. And then another was a colleague who just was skeptical, experienced clinical psychiatry researcher, psychopharmacologist, who just didn't think it would come to be. The other thing I worry about, and I don't know if it's a barrier per se, but since we formed the center, I'd say every day I get 5 to 10 emails from people who say, "You're my last hope." And from what you said, not everybody does well. And you hate to have people think that this is their last, anything's their last hope, because that's a setup for tragedy in some cases. So those are some of my thoughts about barriers. And again, I do think understanding science and what's happening in the brain will lower all the barriers.
I do think that, sorry, I'm getting distracted. This idea of like last hope and, somebody's like kind of holding out for a miracle. If what they keep hearing is that this is a miracle cure and a miracle drug, and then they don't get the miracle, they're more likely to blame themselves and not any other number of things that cause the problem.
I mean, I found that all the treatments we've ever gotten have been a miracle for some people. So yeah. I was, on the scientific advisory board for Lilly when they delivered Prozac, and I don't know if you remember the excitement about that, but it was a miracle for a while. It's like what Osler said: you have to use new treatments while they still work.
Right. Well, that's actually a great quote. I don't know if we want to talk about the placebo effect, but it's certainly, the placebo effect exists absolutely in all of psychiatric research, but it's pretty strong in psychedelic research. And, one of the things that people sort of, if they're going to, I don't want to say nitpick, but if they're going to critique psychedelic studies, they could always bring up this issue that it's very hard to actually blind anyone. It's really hard to blind the research subject or the clinician. Although I have definitely heard about stories where people were wrong and they thought they got placebo and they didn't, or they thought they got active drug and they didn't. So it may not be as hard.
Placebo effects. Placebo is great. The changes in the brain look just like therapeutic effects. placebo tends to be a little less durable, but no less impactful. It's just
Yeah,
that
and
you can't give it.
It seems to speak to this idea that some of the healing that we do is really that we heal ourselves, and if we're given sort of permission to do that, we may not even, need the medicines.
We can't become
Dan-
unstuck.
Yeah, getting unstuck is a great title also. Daniel, I was wondering if
Yes.
you could talk about this idea that we need the biotech to sort of fund the clinical research, like how funding ends up enabling drug development and drug distribution. This issue of accessibility, right? I mean, as evil as it may be to be fundraising or, being a VC person, the reality is that these things need a tremendous amount of money to happen. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the scale of, like, when you're talking to a company that's pitching to you, are they looking for 100,000? Are they looking for 100 million? What does it take? This accessibility is important to all of us, right? And like, how can we scale up? So just issues of development, distribution, scaling, accessibility, no big deal. Little question.
No, just little things. Well, we're gonna find out how this all plays out in the next few years. But there are a range of businesses out there at various stages raising capital, and they may be raising a few million for the first stage, but if it's drug development, and this is primarily, I mean, we are primarily in a drug development business at this stage, right, of our fund. We have it'll be a highly diversified venture fund across the psychedelic ecosystem, but make no mistake, it is really about 70% biotech and drug development, because we do need these drugs to go through clinical trials and be approved and be out there before we can even work with them. We'll talk about, obviously there's the legalization side in Oregon and working with medicines that, that way, and we're very supportive of that. But in terms of this medicalized route, it takes a lot of capital. And these companies that are out there raising $1, $2, $10 million right now will need to raise $100 or $200 million in the very near future for the next stage of clinical trials. And not all of them are going to be able to, it's easy to raise right now $5 or $10 million. Everyone's excited about psychedelics. It's not as easy to get sophisticated biotech investors for those, $200-300 million plus checks. That's when things get a little more challenging for these companies. So one thing we're focusing on at Palo Santo that I think is a little different than some other psychedelic investors is we are making sure that we collaborate very closely with the leading biotech investors as well. They haven't been in the psychedelic space. It's been this group of very passionate psychedelic investors and that's fantastic. We need them too, but the biotech investors, the larger ones, are going to provide a different level of downstream capital that can be a problem. And we're working with companies now, founders that are very focused on understanding how to raise capital, not just now in this sort of hype stage of psychedelics, but in the future when they need hundreds of millions for clinical trials, and that's a trickier prospect. So we're working with the companies very directly on that issue. We're often the lead investor we're not often, there are a few deals where we're the lead investor where we will only get involved if there is really excitement from biotech investors, because we don't want to see this money go down the drain. No one wants to see that, not just from a financial standpoint, but a waste of time and resources. So we're getting more involved with the biotech investors. I think it's going to be a really good thing for advancing innovation. And there are a lot of companies out there that just don't get the right attention. There's a lot of great headlines for certain companies that maybe we're not as excited about, and there's no headlines for companies that we're super excited about that we think the biotech investors will eventually start to notice and join the party. So
you want to name names there, or just leave things unsaid?
No. Well,
okay.
in terms of companies, no. Well, we can get into that. I'll start telling you all about our portfolio and how excited I am, and then we'll use up the whole slot. So I'll stop there, and we can get there.
Hey, Shelby, Daniel mentioned something that I'd love you to pick up on, which is this whole sort of other issue, not drug development, but decriminalization, the right to try lawsuit. I mean, can you talk about all these sort of other avenues that aren't drug development?
Yeah. So for I don't know how much people who are tuning in know about what's going on within the realm of psychedelics. And so I just want to start out by giving a little bit of context, which is that the two primary compounds that are being investigated right now for therapeutic potential that are really kind of making headway with the FDA are psilocybin and MDMA. Psilocybin is being studied for major depressive disorder and treatment-resistant depression, and MDMA is being studied for post-traumatic stress disorder. And the different companies that are investigating these compounds anticipate that they'll be legalized in therapeutic contexts within the next 5 years or so. And there's a lot of questions around what that's going to look like. Is it going to be covered by insurance? If you don't actually have one of these indications, are you going to be able to access these treatments through something that's called off-label? The reason why this is relevant in the context of, end of life care is because if you are at the end of your life, whether you have a diagnosis or you don't have a diagnosis, firstly, you're likely not going to be able to access a psychedelic, in the next year through the FDA, unless, there's some exceptions. There's things called expanded access and stuff, which we can get into, but for the most part, they're not going to be legalized through the FDA in the next year or two. And so, we have to think about, the fact that, people, it's wonderful, everything that's happening in the realm of drug development. It's very exciting, but there are a lot of people, whether they're at the end of their life or not, who are suffering now. And what do those people do? And those are the people that, Jerry hears from, and I'm sure Dr. Holland you hear from, and DoubleBlind hears from. Every single day we're getting emails and messages on our Instagram saying, I'm suffering, I want access to a psychedelic, help me. And there's really only so much that we can say to these people. There's a few different options. You can explore ketamine, right? Because ketamine clinics are legal and you can get ketamine off label for depression. You could potentially go abroad to a psychedelic retreat center, such as Synthesis in the Netherlands, or you could try going to an ayahuasca retreat center in the Amazon. But there really aren't a lot of options. And one of the things that I was really struck by when I was reporting a piece for our column on Rolling Stone was I was interviewing these two cancer patients who, along with their palliative care physician, are suing the Department of Justice and the Drug Enforcement Administration for access to psilocybin therapy now via something called the right to try laws. Now, the right to try laws are very, very complicated. After a lot of reporting, I still don't understand all the nuance here, but what I can tell you is that there are 40 states that have right to try laws. And the federal government also has a right to try law, which Donald Trump signed in 2018. And right to try essentially means I have a diagnosis that is not treatable with the currently available treatments on the market. And so I have a right to try a medicine which is currently being investigated by the FDA through FDA-approved clinical trials, but hasn't yet been approved. And so, these patients want to access psilocybin through the right to try law for reasons, again, that I won't get into because it's complicated. The Drug Enforcement Administration said no. So now they're suing the DEA and the DOJ to get access. And so that might be, a mechanism. We'll find out, they're in the process of back and forth in the courts right now, but we'll find out in the next 12 or 18 months, potentially, if they win this case, then anyone who has an end of life diagnosis may be able to, who lives in those 40 states with right to try laws, may be able to access psilocybin that way. Now, I don't want to go on for too long, but, other sort of mechanisms for access could include potentially access to a psychedelic through something called RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. There hasn't been a lot of success this way, but the First Amendment in the Constitution, we all have a right to practice our religion of choice. There's been two groups of people in the United States that have received access through the federal government to psychedelics through RFRA. One of them is the Native American Church. They've been granted access to peyote. Another is the União de Vegetal, which is a Brazilian church, which has been granted access to ayahuasca. There's been many, many organizations, churches, groups of people who have tried to receive exemption through RFRA for access to psychedelics and have been rejected by the DEA, most notably a church called I'm going to say church in quotes, called Soul Quest in Florida. But there's, there's really not a lot of clarity from the DEA as to what, does and doesn't qualify as a church. And so there are, policy advocates who are essentially pushing the DEA to clarify, what does and doesn't qualify as a religious use of a psychedelic. But one of the reasons why this is so relevant in the context of end of life care is because of what I talked about way back during my introduction when I said, not everybody who's at the end of their life has a diagnosis. And one of the things that's been sort of arbitrary that we've seen in the realm of cannabis, at least, Madison and I talk about a lot, is that what we've done is we've essentially grouped cannabis into there's two types of use of cannabis. There's recreational use and there's medical use. And this is sort of, anyone who's ever done a psychedelic knows this is kind of a false dichotomy, because firstly, you're leaving out the spiritual use of a psychedelic, which whether or not you're going into a psychedelic saying, this is my religion, psychedelics can be deeply mystical, and those mystical experiences can be intricately tied to their therapeutic outcomes, which we've seen at trials like Johns Hopkins and NYU and other institutions. And also, it doesn't leave space. This system that we've created, that it's recreational or it's spiritual or it's medical, it doesn't leave space for the reality of the psychedelic experience and why it's so healing. And we just don't want to see, we want psychedelics to be legalized through the FDA, but we also don't want to see people get left behind. And that requires innovating around how we conceive of what medicines do, how they function, who they're for. Something that Bob Jesse, who we all love, calls the betterment of well people. What about people who don't have a diagnosis, but who, could benefit from these treatments? Where do they go?
Well, I appreciate the breadth of your answer, and you ticked off a lot of boxes of things I want to ask you about. So I'm glad that you spoke about the right to try lawsuit and the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. But you also mentioned, and you talked about this before, a couple things I wanted to, you used the word disruptor a while back. And I think that is a great way to think about, psychedelics are disruptors. Psychedelic assisted psychotherapy is sort of a new disruptive mechanism. It's potentially a disruptor to the field of psychiatry and even to the field of palliative care. I did want to talk about this indication issue that I know that I believe Reset Pharma, and there may be other people too, who are pushing for this indication, not a diagnosis, but a symptom of existential distress. And this is a conference about end of life issues. And I was wondering, Daniel, if you could talk a little bit about Reset Pharma. I know that you're a major investor in them and that they are really focusing on cancer patients, end of life issues, existential distress. Why palliative care? Why end of life?
Well, the quick answer to why end of life is, very obvious. We're all going to die. I know the people that I have witnessed dying recently, especially from cancer, naturally have high levels of we can call it depression, anxiety, existential distress, all the above. Again, I think it would take a lot of personal work through our lifetimes and a very, very special personality to naturally have that process, go through that process naturally and not experience those quote symptoms, right? Which are obviously very normal. What I'll say is, Reset Pharma is a good example, and you'll hear from Dr. Stephen Ross later today. Look, they're developing psilocybin, eventually other psychedelic therapies for patients with cancer and other life-threatening diseases. It does sound like we're pathologizing death, right? It does sound like we're trying to come up with this with this calling death, giving it like an indication, which effectively we are to get it approved, right? If we want to create access for everyone, and I am fully supportive of the legalization movement, the broader legalization movement, for all the reasons Shelby described, incredibly important. We also have to have it be available and safe and regulated, especially for people that really have no interest in psychedelics and are only going to hear about this treatment through their oncologist or their psychiatrist or their MD, right? There are going to be people that have no interest in psychedelics or an experience, and they're not going to want to, grow their own mushrooms for a lot of reasons. There are going to be a lot of people that do, and we support that. But to get this approved, we really need to, work with the FDA and go through the same hoops that and for any other drug. So, I think that it does sound like we're in a way pathologizing death, but we're playing the game that needs to be played with, certainly with the FDA to get these drugs approved for, I think, even a bigger, wider audience, or at least it's an addition to others that that Shelby's talking about. It's a pretty big tent. I think we need the medicalization movement and the legalization movement working together, and we'll have options for sort of both groups of people. It's not a dichotomy. There's probably a Venn diagram where they intersect. But I think to get this into the hands of the most amount of people, we do need some FDA approved drugs as well. And so we have an indication. We're going to create, they're going to go for an indication that describes what people are going through with, late stage cancer that are suffering. And I'm okay with that.
And yet people do get medications towards the end of life, particularly, towards the very end of life, for distress without a diagnosis, without necessarily a diagnosis that you have depression, you have an anxiety disorder, you're just uncomfortable, and and we're going to ease your way, and we give you medicines. And so the actual practice doesn't, is sort of what you're talking about.
Can I ask a question? I don't know if either of Daniel or Jerry know the answer, but I'm wondering, is existential distress or whatever it is that they're trying to study, is that going to have to be put into the DSM, the official diagnostic manual for the American Psychiatric Association? Or how does that work exactly, that you create an indication that people don't really conceive of right now?
Yeah, so the FDA does recognize the DSM, which is interesting, but they have shown some flexibility recently and allow indications for components of diagnoses or symptoms that you have to pursue your clinical trials somewhat differently. Like you can get an anxiety diagnosis an anxiety indication without a diagnosis if you study anxiety comorbid with 3 different other conditions. So they're willing. I think they're willing to talk about it now in a way they weren't before. There's flexibility. As far as changing the DSM, we've got complicated grief in there now. Now we just have to understand complicated grief as something you can have about yourself and not just another. And maybe that would be a path.
Well, that's a really interesting idea, actually, Jerry. I've been saying for a while with my patients, like if we knew how we were going to die, where, how, when we were going to die, if we knew that there was some mechanism when things got bad that we could be like, okay, I'm done, I want to go now. I talk about it as if if you're at a terrible party, you should be allowed to leave. Now, if you have some sort of psychiatric disorder or diagnosis that's making it impossible for you to enjoy a good party, then I can understand treatment. But there are some situations where everybody would agree that this person should be able to bow out now. And if we could help people with that, I really think that it would be transformative, and it would decrease a lot of anxiety and probably a lot of pain perception. We've got a little bit of time left, and I think I want to wrap up by asking each of you, what should we be most excited about, and what should we be most cautious about regarding the sort of evolution of psychedelic medicine, psychedelic therapies? Like where are the landmines, and where are the stem and the roads, as they say? Shelby, would you like to go first?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm just excited about the momentum, and I'm excited that there's momentum on multiple fronts, as Daniel referenced. I'm excited about what's happening with the FDA, but I also am excited about what's happening with the decriminalization movements, which we didn't really get a chance to talk about. But there's more than 100 cities and counties now that are looking to decriminalize psychedelics at the local level. And alongside these decriminalization campaigns are public education initiatives, because if folks are going to be either voting at the ballot box or trying to get city council members on board to pass an initiative, it requires a massive amount of education around what's even happening within the psychedelic movement. So I think that these initiatives are a really exciting opportunity to, just inform these swaths and swaths of Americans that I referred to before, about what is happening, all the things we've been talking about today. And I think in terms of cautions, definitely, really paying close attention to all the stuff we talked about around access, what happens when psilocybin and MDMA and some of these other compounds that are being investigated get to market. Of course, something we talk about a lot at DoubleBlind, which we didn't really talk about today, is upholding the reverence for indigenous wisdom and not kind of creating this hierarchy in which we say, doing psychedelics in a clinical context is more legitimate than, say, doing them ceremonially. We're all about just doing them however most serves the person who wants to do them, as long as they're being respectful to the traditions and they're being safe. So those are all things that, we're paying close attention to, and we hope will continue to be a part of the conversation.
Jerry, would you like to go ahead with the things that you're most excited about, and also what you feel sort of cautious about in the field of psychedelic medicine?
Yeah, so first and foremost, I'm pretty confident in 2 or 3 years there'll be tools that will help some of patients that we've not been able to reach with current treatment. So that's important. And I also view these, the extant psychedelics that people are focusing on as forerunners. I mean, that there will be new developments based on how we understand these work and how they work, and we'll have more efficient, accessible treatments down the road. On the other side, I think we have to pay attention to history and be cautious about letting our enthusiasm wash over people who aren't ready for it. And we've seen setbacks that were political, historically. Look, we've lost decades of opportunity to have learned about and used these agents for reasons that had nothing to do with how these agents work and what they do to people. So we have to keep that in mind. We have to be focused on not tripping ourselves up, of paying attention to the process and again to the science and to the conversation with others who are not yet on board.
Thank you, Jerry. Daniel?
I'm excited about a lot of things. The movement, the cultural shift is amazing to see, especially even in the last year. I don't think I've ever witnessed a shift in mindset. It reminds me very much of course, of cannabis, and also I would say gay marriage, in terms of just how fast you could talk to some second cousin or third cousin or your grandma or an aunt about this, and you're not wild and crazy. That's amazing. I'm very excited about innovation generally. I'm excited to see science potentially driving the policy, in the sense that rarely happens, but that there does seem to be some connection between scientific results and acceptance here, and hopefully driving policy. Very excited about second and third generation psychedelics. I think that we are not going to be taking the same drugs 40 or 50 years from now, or 10 years from now, that we have in the last 40 years, or they'll be slightly different. I don't think we're not driving the same cars that were invented 50 years ago, and I think we're going to see some real serious innovation with all the talent coming into psychedelics. So I'm excited for both the medicalization side of it and the legalization side, and I think in 10 years that we might not be drawing such big distinctions between the two. I think they're going to be very supportive of each other, and people will have different ways to access these medicines that are hopefully appropriate for them.
Do you want to mention anything else that we should be cautious about, or would you like me to take over on that part?
Well, on the business side, we have to be very careful. I'll just speak to where the business is going. We have to be very careful about companies that are making claims that are well beyond where they're really at in terms of development, and they're raising a lot of capital at very high valuations. And we're going to see some headlines here about a bubble at some point. I mean, part of what we're doing in our fund is making sure that we're really, really heavy on the diligence and the science, and we come from a business background, healthcare services, venture capital, so we're paying attention to those evaluations and where we should be investing at the right stage. But we're going to see some headlines that'll make the space look a little ugly at some point. I think we'll be well positioned for that, but I think it'll happen, and we have to be ready for that.
I just want to sort of clean up on a few questions that are coming up. People are asking about working with octogenarians, nonagenarians, people with Alzheimer's. All of this research is being at least discussed, if not actively pursued. People are absolutely looking at aging, at decreasing neuroinflammation, at psychedelics being neuroprotective, much the way that cannabinoids are neuroprotective. So I think we'll be seeing more of that research. I don't want to end on a bummer, but I think there's a lot to be cautious about, people not being prepared, not being educated. We still have huge problems with racism and stigma and unequal access. There's this fear of sort of extracting knowledge from the indigenous community without really giving back to them. So I know there are some companies that are actively giving back to indigenous populations. There's just, it's pretty white and male in this space, and that is an issue. And also there's absolutely this issue of what I jokingly refer to as shamans behaving badly, which is people that are entrusted to guide psychedelic assisted psychotherapy sessions who are misbehaving in all the ways that humans misbehave with each other. And these things could happen without the psychedelics, but psychedelics are, catalysts and intensifiers. So sometimes things are getting, boundaries are intensely transgressed in these situations. So that's something that we need to be vigilant about. I know that we have to wrap up. I really appreciate Dr. Rosenbaum and Mr. Goldberg and Ms. Hartman for joining us. Thank you also to NWELL for hosting this entire conference and this panel.